All right, so you want the real deal on budget day. Not just what it is, but the traditions, the history, the global quirks. We're going deep on how different countries handle this surprisingly fascinating event. It's like a peek behind the curtain of global finance, but maybe with less jargon and a lot more fun facts.
Sounds intriguing.
Yeah, to navigate this financial landscape, we've got our expert here. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, ready to break it all down.
Think of me as your stand-in, the curious one, asking all those questions you'd want to know. So let's start with a country that's practically synonymous with budget day, the UK. I've heard it's quite the spectacle.
It definitely is.
Is it always this big formal affair?
Oh, absolutely. The UK's budget day usually falls on a Wednesday in March, just before their fiscal year kicks off, which, fun fact, still aligns with the Julian calendar. And it's not just about the date, it's a whole carefully choreographed process. The chancellor, who's like their finance minister, briefs the cabinet, even gives the monarch a sneak peek before presenting it to parliament.
Hold on, the Queen gets a preview. That's a pretty exclusive club. What about the actual presentation in Parliament? Is it all stuffy speeches, or are there some, let's say, unconventional traditions involved?
Oh, definitely some unique customs. The chancellor is traditionally allowed to drink whatever they choose during the speech,
Really?
even alcohol, which is typically forbidden in the House of Commons.
Wait, seriously. So we're not talking about a discreet sip of water here. What kind of beverages have we seen?
It's varied over the years. Think Kenneth Clark with his whiskey,
Wow.
Geoffrey Howe opting for gin and tonic, Benjamin Disraeli enjoying brandy and water, Nigel Lawson liked a spritzer,
Sounds like a good time.
and then you have William Ewart Gladstone who went for sherry with a beaten egg.
Sherry and a beaten egg. That's a choice. I guess crafting a national budget requires some fortifying, right?
You could say that, although these days chancellors mostly stick to water. Maybe a sign of the times.
Probably for the best. So after the chancellor lays out the budget, what happens next? Is it all just polite applause, or does it get a little more, shall we say, spirited?
Definitely a flurry of activity. Historically, news services would rush to report things like tax changes on everyday items, particularly beer. People would be on the edge of their seats, waiting to hear if their pint just got cheaper. It was almost like a sporting event. After the initial frenzy, there's a debate in the House, which can stretch on for days.
Can you imagine waiting for the news to find out if your beer got cheaper? Talk about high-stakes economics. But okay, all this pomp and circumstance in the UK, is that the global standard for budget day?
Not quite. Some countries take a very different approach. For example, let's look at Sweden. They're all about accessibility. Imagine scrolling through a park and coming across a document detailing the entire national budget. Transparency is their motto.
Wow, that's a stark contrast to the UK's theatrics. So no sherry for the Swedish finance minister then.
Not quite. They have their own traditions. But while we're talking about contrasting approaches, let's jump over to Ireland. They've got their own unique style.
Right, Ireland. What's their budget day vibe like?
Similar to the UK, their budget day typically lands in early December. The Minister for Finance usually does a photo op with a briefcase, although there have been some interesting variations, floppy disks, even CD-ROMs. And the speech itself is broadcast live on radio and television. But here's the kicker. Some tax changes on things like alcohol, tobacco, and petrol are implemented at midnight.
Midnight. Sounds like there could be some very interesting New Year's Eve style celebrations or maybe commiserations depending on the changes. So we've got the UK with its ceremony, Sweden going for transparency, and Ireland with its media blitz and midnight deadlines. What about other parts of the world? Do we see any more of these briefcase-wielding finance ministers?
Well, the Netherlands joins the Briefcase Club. Their budget presentation is actually tied to the monarch speech, known as Prinsjesdag, which happens on the third Tuesday of September.
Okay, this briefcase thing is definitely a trend. It's like the budget's official mascot.
You could say that. But let's switch gears a bit. Hong Kong takes a slightly less flashy approach, focusing more on the appropriations bill and spending announcements. Their budget day usually falls in late February.
All right, last stop on our world tour. What about the good old USA? Do they have a big budget day blowout?
Actually, the U.S. doesn't have a single designated budget day. Congress takes the lead on budget legislation, although the executive branch typically submits proposals beforehand.
No dramatic briefcase reveal for the U.S. Come on, America, step up your budget game.
I mean, they're just more pragmatic. But speaking of interesting budget presentations, let's shift our focus to India, where Budget Day is a monumental event.
I've heard it's a huge deal over there.
It absolutely is. In fact, the Indian Constitution mandates the presentation of the Union Budget, also known as the Annual Financial Statement, on the first day of February. This tradition has been upheld since the country's independence.
Wow, so it's not just a tradition, it's a constitutional obligation.
Yeah.
That definitely elevates the stakes. What's the historical backdrop of this tradition?
Well, the first Union Budget of independent India was presented back in November 1947 by R.K. Shanmugam Chetty. Of course, it's evolved significantly since then, reflecting India's economic and political journey.
I can imagine. India's undergone some incredible transformations over the decades. But before we dive into that, were there any particularly noteworthy moments or figures in India's Budget Day history? Any standout personalities or events that shaped this tradition?
There are quite a few. Morarji Desai, who served as finance minister multiple times, actually presented the budget twice on his birthday. And Indira Gandhi made history as the first woman to hold that position.
That's amazing. It really speaks to the evolution of Indian society and politics. What about some of the more recent changes to India's Budget Day? You mentioned it's evolved over time.
In 2017, a significant change occurred. The railway budget, which had been presented separately for an incredible 92 years, was merged with the general budget.
That's a pretty big shift. What was the reasoning behind having separate budgets for so long?
It's a fascinating echo of colonial history. Back then, India's budget presentation was actually timed to follow the UK's budget announcement. This was due to the time difference between the two nations. Can you imagine India waiting for the UK to reveal its financial plans before setting their own?
That's incredible. It really highlights the lasting impact of colonial history, even on something as seemingly technical as budget presentations.
Absolutely. And speaking of timing, there was another major shift in 2001. Before that year, the Union budget was always presented at 5 p.m. on the last working day of February. But then, in a symbolic move to break from colonial tradition, the then finance minister, Yashwant Sinha, shifted the announcement to 11 a.m.
So they moved it from evening to morning. What was the significance of that change?
It was a deliberate move to make the budget announcement more accessible to the people. By presenting it earlier in the day, more people could follow along live without having to stay up late.
That makes sense. It's like saying, hey, this budget is about you, the people, so we're making it easier for you to be a part of it.
Precisely. It's about transparency and engagement. And in a country as vast and diverse as India, that's crucial.
You know, as we're exploring all these different approaches to Budget Day, I'm realizing it's so much more than just numbers and spreadsheets. It's a glimpse into a country's values, its history, its relationship with its people.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a unique window into how a nation operates.
It really makes you think about the different ways countries choose to present their financial plans to the world. And on that note, we've covered a lot of ground already. From sherry-sipping chancellors in the UK to midnight tax changes in Ireland. From transparent budgets in Sweden to symbolic shifts in India. It's been quite a journey.
It certainly has. We've seen how something as seemingly straightforward as Budget Day can actually reflect a nation's history, its values, and its approach to governance. But there's still so much more to explore.
Exactly. And that's what we'll do when we come back for part 2 of our deep dive into Budget Day around the world. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Budget Day around the world.
All right, so before the break, we were just starting to unravel the complexities of India's Budget Day. We talked about its constitutional significance and some of the key figures and changes throughout history. But I'm curious, what's the public reaction like? Is it a national holiday? Do people gather around the TV to hear the announcements?
It's definitely a major event in India. While it's not an official holiday, there's a palpable buzz in the air. News channels provide extensive coverage, experts weigh in, and discussions about the budget's impact dominate public discourse. For many, it's a time of anticipation, anxiety, and hope all rolled into one.
It makes sense. After all, the budget directly impacts people's lives, their livelihoods, their futures. It's not just about abstract numbers, it's about real-world consequences.
Precisely. And in a country as vast and diverse as India, with its complex economic and social landscape, those consequences can be far-reaching.
So we've talked about the UK, Ireland, Sweden, the Netherlands, Hong Kong, the US, and India. It seems like every country has its own unique approach to Budget Day, shaped by its history, its values, and its political system. But are there any common threads, any universal truths about this global phenomenon?
That's a great question. Despite the diverse approaches, there are some underlying themes that connect these seemingly disparate events. At their core, budget presentations are about accountability, transparency, and communication. Governments are essentially laying out their plans for the year ahead, outlining how they intend to manage public funds and address the needs of their citizens.
So it's about more than just balancing the books. It's about setting priorities, making choices, and ultimately shaping the direction of a nation.
Exactly. And that's why Budget Day holds such significance, not just for economists and policymakers, but for ordinary citizens as well. It's an opportunity to engage with the political process, understand the decisions being made, and hold those in power accountable.
It's like a yearly checkup for a nation's financial health. And as we've seen, there are many different ways to conduct that checkup. Some countries prefer a grand spectacle, others a more understated approach.
Mhm.
But ultimately, the goal is the same, to ensure the well-being of the nation and its people.
I think that's a perfect way to sum it up. Budget Day is a multifaceted event, reflecting the unique characteristics of each nation. But at its heart, it's a fundamental act of governance, a moment where the financial and political spheres converge.
And with that thought-provoking insight, we'll wrap up part 2 of our deep dive into Budget Day around the world. But don't go anywhere. We'll be back with more fascinating insights and maybe a few more surprises in part 3. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've journeyed around the world exploring how different countries approach Budget Day. We've seen everything from sherry-sipping chancellors in the UK to briefcase-toting finance ministers in the Netherlands. But before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to you, the listener. After hearing all this, I can't help but wonder, what would your ideal Budget Day look like? Would you go for the pomp and ceremony of the UK?
Or the transparency of Sweden?
Or maybe a completely different approach? What traditions would you start?
That's a fantastic question. It really challenges us to think beyond the existing models, to consider what values we want to prioritize in our own approach to public finance.
Exactly. Maybe it's about finding a balance between tradition and accessibility.
Between accountability and engagement.
Maybe it's about creating a budget day that truly reflects the needs and aspirations of the people it serves.
Perhaps it's about leveraging technology to make the budget process more interactive and transparent, allowing citizens to not only observe, but actively participate in shaping their nation's financial future.
And that's the beauty of these deep dives, isn't it? They spark curiosity, challenge assumptions, and leave us with more questions than answers.
They remind us that there's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider.
More ways to engage with the world around us.
Absolutely.
So to our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
And who knows, maybe you'll be the one to revolutionize Budget Day in the future.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. Until next time, keep those minds curious.